Well, I'm super excited about this new series we're kicking off today called The 800-Pound Gorilla. And I think it's going to be so helpful and filled with hope. And I just know for me personally, what we're going to be looking at over this coming weeks is going to be something I need. And I think just maybe what you need. So let's step into this journey together with this question. What do you fear? I mean, the quick blink answer to that question, maybe for you, when you think about something you fear, maybe you think about spiders. I mean, that's not for me. I love spiders. I have one on my back deck right now, and it's like a masterpiece of web art. I mean, the thing that this one spider is doing, I sat out there this morning, I just looked at it, and I was like, it's amazing. But for some of you, I mean, only good spider is a dead spider. Maybe for you, when you think about what do I fear, it's clowns. It doesn't matter the type of clown. It could be a cute clown as a kid's birthday party, or maybe it's one of those scary clowns anchored to, that movie. Or maybe for you, I mean, this is a big one for most people. Maybe what you fear is public speaking. In fact, you can't even imagine doing what I do almost every week. Now, maybe you're wondering, what am I fearful of? What am I afraid of? Well, this is it. No, I'm not scared of beds. That would be weird. What I'm scared of is, tight, confined, dark spaces. I mean, just a few weeks ago, I was looking for something. I couldn't find that something, and I thought for sure maybe it got stuck underneath our guest bedroom bed. I was underneath there, and stuff is it's been crammed in there for years. I found myself starting to army crawl underneath it to try to see if I could find it, and then all of a sudden, overwhelming fear, like that I was going to get stuck, or that someone was going to come up my stairs and attack me while my ankle stuck out of the back of the bed. I mean, I'm just scared of dark, confined spaces. You know those big water pipes that go underneath roads? I literally have a fear of crawling into one of those, getting stuck, water come rushing through, and I just drown there. Like, it bothers me. Movies that have someone crawling through like a small cave and they're trying to get to the other side. I'm just like, I just got to fast forward through. There's something about, small, dark spaces that just, gets my body responding. So what do you fear? I don't want to minimize spiders or beds or public speaking or clowns. But what do you really fear? Really fear? What keeps you up at night? What causes your mind to race? What causes your heart to beat out of your chest? What sends your body into like this tense overdrive? What do you really, really fear? Well, that's the journey we're going to be on here in the 800-pound gorilla. You see, for all of us, we're battling the gorilla. For all of us, it imposes this will on our life. We try to kick it out, but it won't leave. We try to isolate it, but it makes himself known. We try to shove it in a cage, but the 800-pound gorilla is not going to be shoved in any cage. We try to run from it. We try to flee from it. We try to escape from it, but it's still there. And you might be wondering, what is that 800-pound gorilla? Well, here in a little bit, you're going to fully realize what it is. And again, you're dealing with it now, and so am I. Now, in this series, we're going to follow a storyline of a guy named Elijah. Elijah is a great person with a great story. Maybe you're familiar with it. Maybe you've never heard his story before. But Elijah had a simple job description. The Bible calls him a prophet of God. And that simply meant this. Wherever God said to go, Elijah went. And then whatever God said to say, Elijah would say. He was God's, let's just say, spokesperson. So he just waited for God to say, go. He would go, and then God was like, this is what I want you to tell that person or that group of people. And so when we step into the story of Elijah, he's going to have a message for someone. So let's jump into 1 Kings chapter 17, and we're told, now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. It gives us a lot of detail from where he's from, but the main point is his name, Elijah. Now, the name Elijah consists of two ancient Hebrew words that get shoved together. The first ancient Hebrew word is these two letters, El, and El is, well, it stands for God or deity. Now, don't forget that because it's really important for you to remember, because this was kind of the generic word for God that other pagan cultures and pagan worshipers and religious structures would use the same two-letter word, El. But the last part of his name is Yah, which stood for Yahweh, God's most intimate name for himself. And so the name Elijah simply means, well, Yahweh is my God. And so we're told that Elijah, and from Gilead, all of a sudden said to, well, a guy named Ahab. Now, who is Ahab, you ask? Ahab at this moment in time was the king of Israel. There was 12 tribes at one point. The 12 tribes broke off. 2 went south, and it was called Judah. And the 10 tribes that went north, well, they're referred to as Israel. It's the northern kingdom. And King Ahab was the king over the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes up north. He was married to a gal named Jezebel. And Jezebel was this evil, maniacal, manipulative person. You'll see that more. And she hated, well, anyone who worshiped Yahweh, the one true God. And so Elijah goes to Ahab because God said, hey, Elijah, I want you to go to Ahab with this message. And this was the message that God gave Elijah. As a Lord, and anytime you see Lord spelled in all capital letters or small caps, you know that the Hebrew word is Yahweh. So as the Lord, Yahweh, the God, that's the word Elohim, and you see these first two letters, El, God deity, of Israel, lives. Now, this is an important word that we can't just overlook. What Elijah is saying is, hey, the God that I follow, the God that is leading my life is active and present. He lives. So many other pagan religious frameworks, the gods were busy doing other things. The gods were not active. They didn't want to mess around with the little lowly human beings because they had better things to do. And Elijah said, my God lives. He's active. He's present. He's with me. He cares. And he goes, whom I serve. Whom I serve. Which is almost a jab at Ahab. Hey, Ahab, you're supposed to be serving Yahweh, God. You're the king of the northern tribes, the people of God. But you see, Ahab and Jezebel were trying to get as many of, the northern 10 tribes to worship 2 other gods. And they were leading them away from Yahweh. And Elijah was like, hey, I serve God, and Ahab, you should be as well. And he goes, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. So what is Elijah saying? No rain until he speaks. And Elijah only speaks when God tells him to speak. Now we have to understand the significance of this promise, that there's going to be no rain. You see, the Canaanite religion, the Canaanites were in the region where, the Bible calls it the promised land. And the Canaanite religious structure was built off of, 3 really major gods. There's more than this, but these are the 3 major ones, and 2 of them we see in the Bible quite often. You see, the head of the Canaanite Parthenon is a god named El. Looks familiar, doesn't it? It means God and deity. El was the kind of the king of all gods. But there's some mystery, especially when the archaeologists found the Ugaritic text that starts to break apart this entire kind of god structure. And there's some differing opinions. Some think that El was the king of all gods, and some think that he still was in place, and some think that he drifted out of place, and some think he just kind of backed into well, kind of the shadows, so to speak. But El gets tethered all the way to Zeus, a god you've probably heard of. Now, El was married to Asherah. Some think Asherah was a daughter, but most think they were married together. But then all of a sudden, there's another god in the Canaanite pantheon that also comes rushing onto the scene, and that's Baal. Now, some think Baal like took El's place. Some think that Baal just kind of became more active as El kind of, moved into the shadows. We're not really sure. What we do know is Asherah and Baal were two of the gods that the Canaanite people worshiped all the time, and the two gods that dominated the so-called promised land, the two gods that Jezebel and Ahab were leading God's people to worship. Asherah was the fertility god, and Baal was called the storm god. Now, these two gods together hit on something that really got to the foundational part of human nature. You see, we got to think back thousands of years, and there was a reality for people living back then, and this was the reality. If there was no rain, then there's no grain, and if there's no grain, then there's no life. Remember, Baal was a storm god, so they desperately needed rain so their crops would grow, so that they would have food, so that they can live. I mean, this is foundational, right? They wanted to live. They needed the rain for their crops. Now, this Canaanite religious structure really hit on two, significant urges. The demand for rain, they wanted to have food, and the drive for sex. You see, the Canaanite religion practiced something that was quite common in other pagan religious structures. It was called sympathetic magic. They thought if they acted out whatever that god did, that they could influence the gods to provide what they wanted. And so when you think about Baal, the storm god, and Asherah, the fertility god, they thought they could influence Asherah and Baal to provide the rain if, and again, at the center of this pagan religious structure was the drive for sex. You can imagine. This is a pretty significant draw for people. And you feel the tension of this throughout the books like 1st and 2nd Kings. The Israelites, God's people, wanting to worship Yahweh. And Yahweh saying, hey, trust me, I know what's best. But yet this other religious framework that said, hey, there's a different type of worship that maybe, just maybe, will convince Baal to bring the rain. And so God sends a message and said, hey, there's not going to be any rain until you hear from my word. And for 3 years, no rain. 3 years is a long time to go without rain. I mean, drought and famine hit the land. I mean, people were trying to convince their gods, Baal, the storm god, to bring rain. And then one day, God taps Elijah on the shoulder and said, now it's time, Elijah. So Elijah went to Ahab with the message that God had for Ahab. And as Elijah approached Ahab, Ahab said this. He goes, so is it really you troublemaker of Israel? And Elijah just gives it right back at him and said, hey, Ahab, it's not me causing trouble. You did. You and your wife Jezebel, you've convinced God's people to worship Baal and Asherah and not follow him. This is all on your shoulders. 3 years without rain, it's your fault, not mine. And then Elijah says, hey, but I got a little competition. You want to agree to it? A little battle royale. And Elijah tells King Ahab, hey, why don't you get your 450 prophets of Baal and your 400 prophets of Asherah, and it'll be all 850 of them versus me. And it'll be your gods versus Yahweh, the one true God. So the battle was set. The competition was set. And early in the morning, The 450 prophets of Baal, the 400 prophets of Asher wake up. They build an altar, they sacrifice a bull, they put it on the altar, and here was the rule. Whose God is going to rain down fire from heaven to consume the sacrifice? Early in the morning, these 850 prophets and prophetesses were dancing and shouting, trying to convince Baal, to convince Asherah, to recognize their plea to rain down fire from heaven. They did everything they could to get, both of their attention. At noon, what we're told in the text is, Elijah starts to mock them, this is hilarious. He starts to scream out to them, hey, you need to shout louder. Maybe they can't hear you. He goes, maybe they're asleep, so wake them up. Maybe they're on vacation. Maybe they're just not paying attention to you. And then there's this one little phrase, maybe they're busy. That's what our English version says. Maybe they're busy. But when you research what that Hebrew word is, you know what Elijah was saying? Maybe they're going to the bathroom. That's the Hebrew word. In fact, it's more specific than that. Maybe your gods are going number 2. I mean, Elijah's sarcastic game was on point. They started screaming louder, dancing more wildly. They had swords out, cutting their bodies, trying to convince their gods to pay attention and rain down fire from heaven. And finally, Elijah had enough. Stepped up, grabbed 12 stones, started to rebuild the altar, killed another bull, put the meat on the wood. But then he upped the game. He instructed for 4 massive containers of water to be brought and dumped all over the altar, drenching the meat and the wood and the ground around it. But he didn't do that once. He didn't do it twice. He did 3 times. And once the ground was completely soaked and the wood was completely soaked, he prayed to God. And God rained down fire from heaven, consumed the sacrifice. Then Elijah instructed to bring all 450 prophets of Baal to him, and he had them all executed. And then they looked out on the horizon, and they saw what looked like a hand, a cloud in form of a hand coming their way, and rain came back into the land. What a story, right? Ahab, in the complete defeat, starts to head back to his summer home. I mean, during this whole epic battle royale between the prophets of Baal and Asher and Elijah, Ahab's wife, Jezebel, was off trying to kill as many prophets of Yahweh, prophets of God, that she could. So she was busy trying to wipe out all the prophets, and Ahab gets back to the house to try to tell her, what was happening. But before he could get back, something else fascinating happens. We're told that, the power of God came on Elijah, and he tucked in his robe, and he ran some 16, 17 miles all the way to Jezreel, beating Ahab there. But Ahab gets there. He tells Jezebel, the mean, maniacal Jezebel, everything that took place. And what does Jezebel do? She gets a messenger and sends this message. May the God strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you, Elijah, just as you killed them. Now, how did Elijah respond? Pause for a moment. I mean, just think about everything Elijah just witnessed. I mean, he's a prophet of God. He's God's spokesperson. Elijah just watched fire rain down from heaven. Elijah, after 3 years, saw this cloud like a hand bringing rain back into the land. And Elijah personally just felt God's power within his body. He just outran Ahab almost 17 miles. I mean, this is what Elijah just experienced. So how does Elijah respond to this messenger? He's afraid, filled with fear, and he ran. He ran for his life. Now let me ask you this question. Was Elijah's fear, because he was afraid, was his fear rational I mean, Jezebel was really good at killing prophets of God, prophets of Yahweh. I mean, she was great at doing that. She was evil and mean and maniacal. Like she had that reputation. Was it rational? Or was it irrational? I mean, again, remember what Elijah just witnessed. Fire from heaven, rain coming back in the land, and God's power on him to outrun Ahab. But you see, I don't think that's the most important question. I think this is the most important question. What caused Elijah to run in fear? What moved Elijah to run in fear? And there's one word in that message from Jezebel that I think is at the center of it. And it starts to define what the 800-pound gorilla is. The word? Tomorrow. Think about that message. Hey, by this time tomorrow. I mean, Jezebel didn't send her entire army. She sent a messenger. She didn't even send an elite group of mercenaries. It was a messenger. I mean, I'm pretty sure, we don't know from the text, but I'm pretty sure this messenger wasn't scary. She sent him a note. And in the note it said, hey, I'm going to kill you. Again, didn't show up. People didn't have swords. It's a messenger. Tomorrow, you see, Elijah was dealing with an 800-pound gorilla, just like you and just like me. And what is that 800-pound gorilla? Well, let me tell you. There's two words that we use a lot of times interchangeably. They're very similar, but yet one thing makes them vastly different. But in their similarities, they impact our bodies in the same exact way. Did I lose you on that? Let me explain. Those two words are fear and anxiety. You see, fear is all about when we see a threat. When you see a threat. A couple of years ago, I went on a hike with my youngest daughter. She was walking Lola, our golden retriever. We were on a beautiful pathway going up the side of a mountain. The sun was out. Birds were chirping. We were having a great time. We were in discussion. And then all of a sudden, a couple miles into the hike, Claire screams, shrieks, as loud as you can imagine. She jumps what feels like a mile ahead of me with the dog. And all of a sudden, I looked down because I was right behind her. I looked down, and there was a rattlesnake right in our path. This one. Now, it was coiled at first when I stared down at it, tail shaking. And he's staring at me like, I'm going to eat you. My entire body seized. She was right ahead of me looking back. Just petrified. You see, that's fear. So when we see a threat, and this is an important part of how our body is wired. Now, anxiety, again, we use fear and anxiety interchangeably, but this is the one thing that makes them vastly different. See, anxiety is when you think about a threat. So the next time I went hiking, you know what I thought about? Oh no. What if I get on that trail and it was going to be a different place, but what if I get on the trail and all of a sudden I start thinking about other things and I come around a corner and I go to step down and this time I step on the rattlesnake. Like I felt my entire body tense up just thinking about hiking again. Now, I went, didn't see a rattlesnake. Didn't see it at all. But I was thinking about it the entire time. You see, our body handles fear and anxiety the same way, whether we see a threat or we think about a threat. And no matter if we think or we see, what happens is there's this little part in our brain, this little red dot down at the brainstem is called the amygdala. That word amygdala is a big word, but it actually comes from a Latin word that simply means almond, like the nut. It's shaped like an almond. And the amygdala has everything to do with our emotions and our memories. Now, other parts of the brain deal with memories as well, but memories get attached to our emotions. And the amygdala is playing around with both of those. And the amygdala is responsible for 4 very specific functions. The first function is this: to detect a threat. It says there's a threat. Like I see a rattlesnake, that's a threat. It's like the bat signal to the body. It's like, hey, you should be worried. The threat's there. If you're driving down I-80, of course, going the speed limit, and all of a sudden a semi-truck comes into your lane, right? All of a sudden, right, there's a threat. It's coming into my lane. And when the amygdala says threat, all of a sudden this other part of the brain called the thalamus is this little egg-shaped orange part of your brain. All of a sudden your thalamus goes, I got to start relaying a whole bunch of information. I mean, this is happening in microseconds. And as soon as the thalamus goes, I got to start getting the entire body focused on this threat. And all of a sudden our body goes to, well, the second function of the amygdala, to trigger a response. This gets into the flight or fight part of our, well, who we are as human beings. So all of a sudden the amygdala is like going, hey, there's a threat. Now the amygdala tells the hypothalamus, which is like the orchestra conductor of everything. So the hypothalamus starts to conduct everything. So it tells the pituitary gland, which then tells the sympathetic nervous system, which then tells our adrenal gland that releases hormones like cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine. And all of a sudden our body goes into full-on, what am I going to do with this threat? Our pupils dilate, our hearts start to race, oxygen starts pumping to the essential muscles of our body. We start to sweat. Why? Because our body is working in overdrive to face this threat. Parts of our body shut down, like our digestive system just shuts down. Why? The threat is right there. We got to do something. We're going to fight or flight. We're going to engage. We're going to run. What are we going to do? Then the amygdala, it's part of our fear conditioning. It is being trained how to handle these threats. And then the fourth one that researchers are just finding is there's actually a positive emotion side to the amygdala. What they're discovering is when it comes to emotions in the amygdala, it has everything to do with the intensity of the emotion. Now, how does this impact the 800-pound gorilla? Well, see, the 800-pound gorilla is the battle raging in our minds. Our bodies are fascinating when it comes to actually seeing a threat. It's a great thing. Rattlesnake, a semi coming over in our lane, right? It's great. It really helps us. In fact, researchers tell us that there's this part called the Amygdala Hijack that literally, when we see a threat or think about a threat, our amygdala hijacks our frontal lobe that has everything to do with rational logic. It just shuts it down so we can respond right away to the threat. But what happens when that threat is just a thought of what might happen? What happens when that threat is a headline about recession? What happens when that thought is financial concerns or job being or company being or factory being shut down? What happens when that threat is, I might be by myself the rest of my life? What happens when that threat is tied to a thought of what might happen, just like Elijah? Well, it might happen tomorrow, but it was a note from a messenger. But for him, that threat caused him to run, to escape. And this is a cycle that gets really dangerous. We engage a threat, we escape, we run away from it, we flee, we change jobs, change churches, change friends, go internal, drink, exercise. There's a whole bunch of ways we escape. And as soon as we escape from that threat, there's relief. We're like, And as soon as our body goes, when you escape from that threat, now next time you engage that same threat, your body is going to increase your anxiety. And this becomes a vicious cycle. Again, when you see a threat, fear, that's good. But when it comes to anxiety and our thought patterns, now we're in this vicious cycle where our body is just amping and amping and amping our anxiety. You see, we have to recognize the 800-pound gorilla, our thoughts and our minds. Now, throughout this series, we want to provide help. And so I just want to encourage you to go to tcconline.tv, click on 800-pound gorilla, and we got some resources there. Maybe for you, you need to take a step for professional counseling. We got some resources there. We're going to have a list of growing resources throughout this series. I just want you to bookmark that, go there. Again, just know, like, we want to help you get the help you need. Now, the Apostle Paul writes some really encouraging words. I just want to end with these words. This is what he writes. For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. We demolish arguments and every pretense that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. And we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. My prayer for you. Step one. Every thought. Take captive every thought. You see, we can rewire how our brain handles anxiety when we think about a possible threat. That's the beauty of our minds. And the first step we got to do, because I think about Elijah and what he started to think about when he received that note. It was so powerful that he ignored the power of God through fire and the power of God through rain and the power of God to cause him to run ahead. The 800-pound gorilla will wreak havoc if you allow it. We're never going to get rid of it, but we can start to try to tame it. And it starts taking every thought captive. Now, I want to pray for you. And then we're going to give you a few moments to answer two very specific questions. This is going to be your time to answer these questions. Lord, I pray for every single person right now. I pray that they will just realize the impact of our thoughts. The 800-pound gorilla is wreaking havoc. But we can start taking steps to recognize and realize. So, Lord, I just pray in these next few moments that every single person will start to process what they can do. What they can do when it comes to the battle for their mind. In your name I pray.